Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Mitch Wellesley, who is CEO and founder of 3G TMS. And today we're going to talk about continuous pool optimization, putting creativity to work in transportation. You know, as we all know, the transportation market, it's dynamic, it's cyclical, and new challenges and complexities are always emerging. That's why creativity and innovation, it's never ends in this industry, and that's particularly true for transportation management systems. Now, in today's episode, we're going to talk about continuous pool optimization, which is one of those examples of putting creativity to work in transportation. And it's great to have Mitch with us today to kind of share his insights and perspective and advice on that topic, as well as more broadly speaking, kind of the ongoing role of transportation management systems in this ever-changing market. So with that, Mitch, welcome to the program.
Adrian, thanks so much. It's great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to talk.
Great. So Mitch, before we kind of dive into the specifics of continuous pool optimization, let's start more broadly by talking about the role of transportation management systems today. Now, you've been in the industry for a long time, since its very beginnings, right? So and I've been looking at it now for over 19 years. So I'm curious from your perspective. I mean, what's changed the most with TMS over the years, and what's remained fundamentally the same?
So I think fundamentally, the idea of a TMS, what it's supposed to do and how it does it, really hasn't changed. The details around it, of course, are night and day different. So what hasn't changed? Well, what is a TMS? Since the mid-'80s, it's been all about you take a bunch of orders in, you use some algorithms to figure out how to move them, use that to save money, you execute them, and you settle the freight bills. Over 35 years or so that we've been doing this, obviously we've increased the computing power, which allows us to use more accurate information. We've increased connectivity so that now we can do a lot more with execution, with tendering and status tracking. We can do a lot more on freight settlement and and so on and so forth. Back I remember doing installations in the 80s when the fact that a TMS could print out a bill of lading and a clerk didn't have to write it up, and they were jumping for joy. I mean, that was the greatest thing since sliced bread. So I mean, it really is. It's a matter of how do we save money by exactly what you were saying, allowing the professional to create as many options for shipping freight as possible, using the TMS to evaluate all those options, and then using all of those data for saving time with execution, whether it be printing a bill of lading or automating tendering or getting good status information and allowing a user to manage by exception and looking at just what's late, all the way to settling freight bills, saving money by doing better audits, and saving time, obviously, by doing better audits. So that whole thing is sort of the same, and yet we could analyze any piece of it and see how fundamentally does the same thing, and yet it does so much more. And obviously, whether it's mobility, I remember when EDI was a big thing, then the internet was a big thing. Now, obviously, we get the data with mobility. We just get better and better, and I'm sure that will continue.
Right. No, absolutely. I think when you see, obviously there's been a lot of changing in a lot of enabling technologies, like, the emergence and rise of cloud computing, the emergence and rise of mobile applications and mobile devices and Internet of Things, and not only EDI but now we're kind of talking about APIs and web services, right? So a lot of these emerging, technologies, the evolution of technology has obviously influenced, the way TMSs work and the types of problems and complexities that TMS are able to handle in a much more efficient way. And then obviously, going back to the mid-'80s to today, the nature of transportation itself has changed in terms of, obviously all the buzz today is around e-commerce and parcel and all that, which is adding some complexity and challenges. But I think, the those fundamental basics still the same, right? It's about meeting service level requirements in a cost efficient, manner. That hasn't changed, but everything else around it, has, and it's kind of marrying those two things together in many ways.
Well, that's exactly right. What's really fundamental is just what you said, the craziness of our industry in terms of all of the constraints and all of the unpredictability and all of the dynamics makes doing this incredibly hard. I mean, you think about the sophistication of an algorithm that does routing, and we have to estimate within the algorithm, okay, how long is it going to take to deliver this 4-stop truckload? How long then will it take to deliver the LTLs from the pull point in the 3rd stop? When frankly, we don't know how long it's going to take to drive across town, let alone 1,500, 2,000 miles. So, let alone the fact that, okay, you build a load and you say, this is really great, but the carriers don't have availability, or we have a stock out, or something doesn't palletize well. So everything that we do is based on uncertainty and dynamics. So that's why everything in a TMS is based on collecting these options, figuring out the best way to do it. But then the key is, are we dealing with all the constraints appropriately so we can build loads that work and and everything TMS recommends is executable? And then how do we deal with the changes when the recommendations don't work? And it's those two things I think that most people really don't understand. And those two things are really what makes a TMS successful, particularly when you want to do something that's creative, which is where we're going with continuous pool optimization. If all you want to do is say, here's 100 orders, I'm going to build 100 LTL shipments. Yeah, that's pretty easy. I think anybody can do that. But when you want to start saying, hey, I'm going to run multi-stops, I'm going to run pools, I'm going to evaluate these other options with continuous pool optimization, each of those, the algorithm gets harder, the constraints get harder, and the execution gets harder.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. Like I mentioned, I've been looking at this market now for over 19 years. And, sometimes I get the question is like, how can you continue to write about TMS? I mean, haven't you written everything there is to write about TMS after 19 years? And on one hand, yeah, maybe, but the reality is that there's continued innovation, there's continued complexities in this industry, that there literally is something new every day in this market and every year. So let's get now into kind of the topic at hand here. Speaking of creative solutions to complex problem, let's talk now about continuous pool optimization, which you've already mentioned here. First, I mean, let's define it. I mean, what is continuous pool optimization?
So we've struggled in the industry since the beginning with the challenge of how do we model and execute moves when we in effect don't know the enough information to do the last piece of it. So in other words, pool distribution traditionally is, I take the freight, I run to a carrier's terminal, I go to the terminal, I blow out a bunch of LTLs. That's simple pool distribution. We've been doing that. Frankly, that's why I wrote the first TMS in the 80s. The challenge has been, if I'm going to bring it to let's say to some kind of a DC where it can sit. Okay, now I don't know how long it's going to sit. I don't know how long it's going to take. And more importantly, when it leaves that DC, I don't know how it's going to move. I don't know for sure. Is it going to be a straight truckload? Is it going to be a multi-stop truckload? Is it just going to be a bigger LTL? Maybe the reason for holding it for a couple of days was it was 1,000-pound LTL and we move it out. It's an 8,000-pound LTL and we just save a lot of money because we brought a lot of others together. So we have the challenge that we don't know the cost or service coming out. We don't know, frankly, what else we can move with that order. So there might be orders that don't exist yet that are originating in another part of the country that are going to hit that warehouse in 5 days. They're going to be cut tomorrow. So there's no way to even know what the options will be when we're doing that first optimization run. So we're left with that challenge, and then we're left also from a data model challenge that we really have to look at. I'm going to route, let's say, that first order leg to that warehouse, to that DC in the most efficient manner, like I normally do. But then once I figure that out, and then I realize, oh, that DC is the right place to go, then I sort of have to break it into two. And I have to say order leg 1 goes to origin to X, to the cross dock, and order leg 2 goes from cross dock to destination. So I sort of now have to create 2 different order legs. And I have to execute each leg, and the operation of one affects the other, because certainly if the first one is going to be late, let's say I have to change the early ship date on the second one, things like that. But to the guy outside, the guy who's querying order 1, 2, 3 and saying, where is it? He doesn't know order leg A and order leg B. He just knows it's in Denver today, or it's in Atlanta today, and it's going to be late or not to the final destination. He doesn't really care that it goes to that crosstalk. So that's really the first half of continuous pull optimization. The second half of it then is, once I have this concept that I can route to these points, well, I don't know that I necessarily want to go to that point. Do I have enough freight today that I'm just going to run a 3-stop load and bypass that point? Or do I have enough time to go to that point? Maybe I just want to go to a pull point at a carrier, or maybe it just makes sense for whatever reason to send it LTL, because I don't have time to do anything else, or some expedited mode. And I could do this at the front end, or typically at the front end or the back end. So I can do the 2 most common situations are, again, running to this warehouse that is maybe, let's say, in Sparks, that services the western part of the U.S., and I can service it from a dozen facilities all around the eastern part of the U.S. And should I go to Sparks, or should I go right to L.A. or right to San Francisco with this move? And then the other one is, well, I've got a whole bunch of shippers in the Atlanta area, and I have a warehouse in Atlanta. And again, I can ship them multi-stop out of Atlanta. I can actually do pickup. I've got 2 big shipments, say, in Atlanta, and run it cross country and make 2 stops in LA. Or I can run multi-stops and LTLs into my warehouse in Atlanta, break them into 2, and then optimize from the warehouse. So those are the basic examples of continuous pull optimization. So we now have to do the first part, which is the physically, how does it work? How does the data model follow it? And then algorithmically, we have to choose between everything that we've always done in a TMS, and now we've added a new mode that has some things that are not definite. And so what we have to do there's a great analogy with truckloads. When we build a load in the TMS, typically we don't know what truckload carrier we're going to get. Truckload carriers don't all have the same rates. They don't have infinite capacity. And so when we look at a truckload, and we're estimating that load is going to go for $2 a mile. We have a load that looks great. Well, today we may have low capacity, and we may be shipping it at 2.25 a mile. We may be shipping it at $1.75 because somebody is around who's particularly aggressive today, or for whatever reason somebody wants a backhaul. So in that case, algorithmically, we have to come up with an approximation, and then as we move forward with execution, we fill in the estimates with what's really happening. And it's really, the analogy is here. It's different how we implement it, but the analogy is the same. We are estimating the cost and service from that distribution point out, but we don't know for sure what's going to happen until, frankly, the freight's picked up on that last leg.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you can see, there's that element of uncertainty, and how the algorithm, accounts for that. There's that layer of, complexity, that's involved here. And I want to, talk a little bit about the technology, that's going to enable this. But before that, I mean, what types of companies or industries are driving demand for this kind of capability? I mean, can you share with us some examples of where this capability, can be used? Sure.
So one of the most common is any kind of 3PL or a large shipper who really has different maybe different business units, different origins. So they we see a whole bunch of 3PLs that have warehouses that are saying, I want to collect freight from my small to mid-sized customers in that area, bring them to their central facility. Again, let's keep on Atlanta for example. So I'm a 3PL. I have a nice warehouse in Atlanta, and I'm going to my small to mid-sized companies in around Atlanta that are shipping around the country, and they're basically saying, I'm going to take your freight. I'm going to figure out, should it go to my warehouse or should it go direct? And then in effect, it's sort of like two different moves. I optimize into the warehouse, and then I optimize out of the warehouse. And the algorithm, again, chooses between going direct and bypassing it, or making some kind of, say, pedal run multi-pickup into the warehouse. Same thing on the other side. Again, I could have a warehouse and I'm distributing in the Southeast, and I've got freight, say, west of the Mississippi and in the Northeast, and it's the same thing. I've got a whole bunch of possible origins, whether they're multiple shippers or multiple warehouses, and I'm running that freight to the Southeast, and I'm looking at, do I drop this freight in that DC in Atlanta? Do I run it as a stop and transit? Do I do it in a traditional pool? So it's really anybody who has enough freight in enough areas in either of those situations. The other one that's sort of interesting is, which we're seeing a little bit of, is companies that are doing some kind of networking where they're moving freight and they don't know, again, what's going to happen as the freight moves forward. We're seeing this. There's a company that does those overnight containers, storage containers, and they might put a few of them on a truck, and they're running them, we'll say this time, from Atlanta to the West Coast. And they've got 3 or 4 on a flatbed. One of those comes off in Dallas. Well, they then have to re-optimize and say, okay, here are 5 that are sitting there in Dallas. Which one do I throw on the back? Is it the one that's going out to the West Coast? Or is it, for example, maybe I'm going to Denver on the way and I can stop in Denver? So it's always evaluating those options. But those five little units didn't all exist when the freight was originating in Atlanta. So it's sort of like an additional alternative to pool distribution when you have more origins and more options.
Yeah, no, I think that those are some good, a good example, particularly in that last one. I mean, I think, the reality is that, when you start the initial optimization you might do is based on the known entities at that point, right? And then things start moving, and now a day passes or 2 days pass, and now you've got other options that start opening up, because now there's new realities involved, and it's the ability to capture those other alternatives and then optimize yet again, to figure out, okay, this is what we knew and we were optimized for on day 1. Now it's day 3, and now these other options, open up, and now what can we do to further fine tune this, or there might be other options that are now present that might be better options that weren't available, we didn't know about or could figure out on day 1, right?
And that's the whole ballgame. That's really, you hit the nail on the head, and that's really been the challenge, for decades. And I've been thinking about this literally for 30 years, we've always built these models on what do we know at the point of time that we are doing the optimization, because that's all you can do. And here we're now doing this in a way where we can, in effect, estimate what is likely to happen or probable to happen in the future, and we can allow for to model that and then to take advantage of that. And that's a huge change and just a huge opportunity. We even see carriers looking at that who sort of almost want to simulate an LTL environment by, again, picking up a bunch of little things and running to a terminal and then finding other things. So it's just a fantastic opportunity for people who, again, want to be more creative. It comes down to what you said in the very beginning. Everything we try to do here is to let TMS users and to let logistics professionals be creative. I mean, the whole thing here is, if our goal at 3G TMS and my goal in 35 years or so in the industry is, we want people to be creative, to come up with really great ideas on better ways to move freight that, improve efficiencies, that cut costs, that cut breakage, that improve customer service, whatever it is that's important. And then we want to come up with ways to model those and execute those and track those. And that's pretty exciting when you think about it. And that's really what a TMS has always been. And this, it's a great way to, with where you began the conversation with where we are today. It's always what we've been doing, and it's just how can we let people be more creative? And that's such a it's such a great thing in our industry, because we don't want people to just do things by rote. If all you do is buy a TMS and automate what you used to do, you just make the same mistakes faster, and that's not doing anybody a lot of good.
Right. Well, speaking of creativity, I mean, obviously that goes hand in hand with innovation on the technology front as well, to be able to enable that creativity. And you touched a little bit on this already, but from a technology standpoint, I mean, what innovations make continuous, pool optimization, possible today versus, let's say, 5, 10, 15 years ago? In other words, I mean, what capabilities should, users look for in a TMS to enable this?
Well, I think that it's a tough question. I think there's a couple things. The first thing really is, some of us in the industry, I'm sure there aren't too many like me who think about this stuff all the time, and have been for a long time. So there's all these really tough problems to solve, and we think about, how do we solve them? So I think the biggest leap actually was just one of those things, like, you're sitting in the shower or lying in bed and you can't sleep at night, something like that. And it's like, holy, wow. And it was one of those moments where really, and this is a problem I've been thinking about for over 20 years. And it occurred to me, this is the way to do it. So I think that's the first thing. It really is, just thinking through and having that, that light bulb moment. The second thing, though, is really, really important as well, which is when you build your TMS and when you build your algorithm, how did you build it? And we built ours in a way, and I think this is fundamental, to evaluate anything that somebody can throw at it, any real world scenario, whether it's, and it really goes hand in hand, there are options and there are constraints. And they're equally important. Constraints may be a little bit more important, but they're both critical. In this case, this was an option. So a TMS that's overly dependent, or at all dependent, I should say, on an off-the-shelf solver has no chance of handling this. This is one of those crazy things that I think are incredibly hard to model unless you come up with a heuristic that's really built around the concept of adding new options and adding new constraints. So when we built, the way we look at things is really simplistically, very simplistically, if I was a really, really, really smart router guy who routed freight for a living, and I'd been doing it for 20 years, and I had unlimited time and resources, what are the infinite, billions of things I would try? And that's really what our TMS does. And that's, I think, the right way you build an algorithm. Now, to do that, you have to sit there and watch literally dozens of people route freight. And you have to talk to them and say, why did you do that? What did you consider? What did you think about? Okay. And that's the way I've been doing it, since the beginning. By building a heuristic algorithm around that, we're able to then say, oh, here's another idea, another way to move the freight, or here's something you can't do, and how do we prevent it? So you need that. The second half is having that fundamental, flexible heuristic that's really oriented to, again, taking new constraints and taking new options. We always come up with new constraints, but they're not so sexy. It's like we don't really come out and say, hey, we figured out a way to model this thing, and now we can prevent every third Thursday when the moon is full, this thing is going to take an extra half hour to unload. that we don't talk about. When we come up with a way of modeling a new option, that's much more exciting.
Yeah, no, and as you were talking there, I mean, I think what you're hearing a lot of conversations today, and I wonder how it relates to this. I mean, I don't go very deep into the nuts and bolts of, heuristics versus other types of modeling technology and all that, but certainly there's a lot of conversation today around the role of machine learning, and particularly around something like a TMS. And arguably, there's already been a certain level of machine learning that's already existed in TMS for quite some time, feedback mechanisms and loops like that. But your thoughts on machine learning? Do you see that as another possible dimension, or another evolution in terms of being able to open up options and things like that moving forward?
I mean, it's certainly possible, but I think, frankly, we used to have a saying at one of my other companies that, we could demo routing freight to the moon, but we had trouble executing freight across the street. And it's, even what we do today is really hard. One of the most frustrating things that we find today is we'll go into an account and we'll be with somebody who is complaining and frustrated by the fact that his margins are being squeezed. Rates are going up. His ability to make a living on the simple arbitrage of buy-sell rating, whether you're a 3PL or a broker, is getting harder and harder. And he's searching for a way to add value. That's very, very common. And then we say, well, we can do optimization and look at these case studies. We've got people, whether they're just doing multi-stops, whether they're doing pool distribution, whether they're doing the continuous pool optimization, whatever it is, and people save a tremendous amount of money. And they look at me and they say, well, we tried optimization with somebody else and it didn't work. And, if there's one thing in our industry where everyone is different and not all of them work, not all of them work well, not all of them are designed to do the same thing, and it's incredibly challenging, I think, when we sit here and we try to help people understand that optimization is not optimization, is not optimization. Whether it's what I talked about before with constraints, so if an optimization engine builds 25 loads and 10 of them can't be run because they violate a constraint, whether it was in the system or not, what do you have? You got nothing. Okay. If an optimization engine makes a recommendation, and then you have things change, whether it's carrier capacity, whether it's stockouts, whether it's things that don't palletize as expected, you can't fit everything on a truck, you have extra room on a truck, you have an order cancellation, you have a high cost carrier today, the results that the optimization recommended no longer make sense. So, I think the challenge we face today is much closer to an analogy of demoing routing freight to the moon and having trouble routing freight across the street. I mean, machine learning is a great idea, but frankly, I think the companies out in the U.S., whether they be shippers or 3PLs, who could save 5, 10, 15% of their freight costs by simply adopting optimization. The number of companies that could do that is astronomical, and the number that have really tried one and said, it didn't work, and just assume they're all similar it's very, very high. So I think that's really the challenge. I think we need something in the industry that gets people to realize that this is not, like buying a commodity, and I'm not, and it's impossible to know. People in a sales process, they want us to run data, and we're happy to run data and say, okay, here's what the model recommends. And that's great. But until you really set it up with all of the real rates, with all of the real constraints, you just don't know. I mean, I remember a few months ago talking with a guy who'd been using, an old product for 20 years. I mean, there were only a handful back in the late 90s. And I said to him, so what happens when this product says, here's a 3 or 4 stop load, and the load is going to cost $2,500, and the LTL costs are $2,800, and you say that's great. and then you have an expensive carrier and the load is $3,000, but you don't even know it. Nobody else has actually said, okay, I'm going to execute these loads separately. I'm going to see how the costs on these loads evolve and see, does this load make sense? Okay. And this is a guy who's been doing it, and it never crossed his mind in 20 years that he should look at the load after he did carrier assignment and say, does that load still make sense for sending those 3 or 4 shipments LTL? Never, ever thought about that. And so machine learning is the least of our problems in this industry. We really need to understand that the world has changed, that there are more options, and we can do things differently.
That's a great point. And regarding with, we tried optimization, but it didn't work. I mean, I've heard that, over the past 19 years, when I've been talking to companies, and a lot of that is also, the fact that, they, I compare it to, a car, right? You've got to, the day one when you buy the car, it runs beautifully, right? But if you don't maintain that car, bring it in for oil change, bring it in for tune-ups and so forth, ultimately it's going to start to degrade and break down and things like that. Well, it's the same thing with the TMS. It might work great on day one because, it was set up with the constraints and rates and so forth that are a reflection of day one's operating reality. But then you're in, day 365 and everything has changed relative to when you first implemented it, but you never went back and, to your point, either look back and see whether whether the actuals, how they related to what you thought, or the assumptions that you were making when you were doing the assumptions, or, the fact that rates have changed, your carrier network has changed, service levels has changed, your constraints have changed, but you never have gone back and, done the fine tuning of the TMS. You have to continuously fine tune the TMS for it to, to continue to deliver value and produce the expected results. Mitch, we're running out of time here, so I'm just going to go, the last couple of questions here. Going back to dynamic, continuous pool optimization. I mean, what are some of the, the benefits, right, that companies are achieving, relative to that?
I mean, I think the main benefit is an extension of really what all TMSs do. Number one, it gives you more options so you can save more money. And number two, it lets you address, if you've got some of these really more eclectic business opportunities that you're looking to leverage. It could be, for example, how to marry stock that's in that warehouse with freight that's coming in. I think again, it's really more of the same. Everything we do is more, it's more of the same. It's sort of like saying when you get an RFP and you got to check 100 boxes. It's not, do you do these things? It's how do you do these things? How do we enable these things?
Great. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, I think, I think the example you gave before in talking about the 3PLs, looking at how do we deliver more value, to customers, or how do we deliver more value back to our organization? I mean, I think ultimately that's what shippers are looking for, whether it's on the, on the cost side, but not only, I mean, what I'm seeing more and more these days is cost is always, cost management, cost reduction is always going to be an important factor. But for a lot of companies today, whether it's a 3PL or a shipper, the service dimension is becoming much more important as well. With things like on time and full requirements, or just, that's going to be the differentiating factor is can we reliably, consistently, meet our customer expectations, and obviously transportation plays a key role there. So to wrap up, I mean, getting back, to the theme of putting creativity to work in transportation. I mean, what emerging, challenges in the industry do you see in transportation that's going to continue to, drive innovation and creativity in order to solve these things?
I mean, I think hopefully, number one, there's a lot that we haven't seen. I mean, hopefully people will, will continue to be more creative. I think a lot of it is we really need people to think in those terms, to think creatively, to think about what do I want to do, and then bring those challenges to us, because that's that's where a lot of this really comes from. And, I think technologically, obviously, getting more information, getting it faster, creating more options, whether it be these kinds of options from an algorithm perspective, or whether they're modal options, adding, three-legged intermodal to replace truckload, figure out where that can happen. I mean, I think everything plays a part with everything else. Everything affects everything else, and most of them, I think, are fairly small. So to me, I think the great thing is really if everybody takes a few steps back in this industry and says, most everybody in this industry really is taught from day one to go for simplicity. Whether it be everybody is taught, okay, I want to have all of my LTL carriers bid off the same tariff. Whether it be, okay, I want to find one pool point to service this part of the country, or whether it's everything has to go on a private fleet, or everything has to go this way, everything has to go that way, because where we all grew up was a day where we didn't have the ability to choose between them. And so everybody sort of in their gut in this industry came from, how do I make things simple so that I can manually figure out, okay, here's an order and this is how it goes, okay? And really the answer is, frankly, it's 180-degree opposite from that. It's simplicity is our enemy. Flexibility is our friend. I was talking to somebody from a big LTL carrier the other day, and we were, he had won some business with one of our accounts. It was a very large account. And we were talking about how we were going to bid this out the next year. And the idea of saying, do we want every LTL carrier to bid off one tariff, or do we want every LTL carrier to bid off the tariff that they're most comfortable with? So most people are taught to go with A. It's a pretty crazy thing, but a TMS is just as fast and just as easy if every LTL carrier bids off their own tariff, or whatever tariff they choose, and let the TMS choose on a move-by-move basis what's more cost efficient, okay? So that really, really simple idea, is just fundamental to not just the TMS, but again, to allowing a shipper or 3PL to achieve his goal. It's the same thing with, do I go pool distribution? Do I go stop in transit? Do I have 5 pool points in the Northeast? Do I have 1 pool point? Do I always use the same one? Do I always use different ones? And the more dynamics that you allow, the TMS is just as fast. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't complain if it's working a little bit harder. It's sort of quiet about that. And it's just gonna, spit out better results, more savings, better service when you give more options. And I think, if there's one thing I hope everybody thinks about is just go back to dynamics and options. Get creative. Really think about what would be cool to do. What would be a really cool thing that I could do that would allow me to achieve these goals of better customer service and lower costs? And then let's figure out how to make that happen.
I love that line. Simplicity is the enemy. Flexibility is your friend. I think that's I might steal that at some point down the road here. I really like that. I mean, and I think just to echo a little bit of what you said. I mean, to me, it's really about continuing to question the status quo, right? And questioning, why do we do this? And continue to ask more what if, right, questions. What if we did this? What if we did that? And then obviously from a technology standpoint, having it be flexible enough to be able to adequately address those ideas and those what if questions. Well, Mitch, like I always say, we always manage to scratch the surface on these topics that we talk about, and there's certainly a lot of meat and food for thought in what we discussed here today. But I think you provided some great insights and advice for our viewers. So again, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Adrian, I really appreciate the opportunity. Love to catch up anytime.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand at the 3G TMS website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Mitch, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.